The sirens weren't supposed to go off. Not here. Not inside the most secure data center in Chicago. Red lights pulsed against the glass walls, reflecting off the rows of humming servers that were supposed to protect the backbone of America's financial network. I stood there, my hands still hovering over the keyboard, watching the monitors flicker like dying stars. Every warning I had written, every report I had filed, every line of code I had begged them to review, it was all happening now exactly as I had said. In less than an hour, Harrington Dynamics would lose everything, and the woman they once called just the IT girl would be the only one left who knew how to stop it. The air was cold and sterile, the way it always was in data centers, but tonight it felt personal. The rhythmic hum of the cooling systems had become a funeral march steady final. I could already imagine the faces upstairs, the polished executives, the board members, the family. Vivian Harrington's manicured hands trembling for once, Michael's composure cracking beneath the weight of headlines waiting to break. And Ryan, her golden son, the self-proclaimed prodigy, realizing that the system he had built to glorify himself was now eating his empire alive. For years, they'd called me paranoid, dramatic, ungrateful. They said I didn't understand the bigger picture, but I understood more than they ever would. I understood what arrogance cost. I understood that the most dangerous virus wasn't in the code. It was in the people who refused to believe they could be wrong. I remembered the day they laughed at me, all of them sitting around that mahogany conference table pretending not to smirk as I presented the vulnerability logs. Claire Ryan had said with that smug half-smile, "You really think our architecture could fail because of a little load test?" He called me our IT girl like I was a child playing with wires. They didn't listen then. They would now. My phone vibrated against the metal desk. Another alert network breach expanding. I opened the log window. The red wave was spreading fast, crawling through the data clusters like wildfire. Client records, transaction protocols, authentication keys, each collapsing in real time, and all of it traceable back to the same flaw I'd begged them to fix. The one Ryan swore was impossible. The irony was poetic. The system didn't just fail, it exposed them. Their greed, their shortcuts, their obsession with optics over ethics. And as the network buckled, I realized that this wasn't just a technical failure. It was the physical manifestation of their moral rot. Outside the server room, I could hear the muffled panic beginning, shouting phones ringing the sound of a fortress crumbling. A week ago, I would have rushed to help, still believing I owed them something. But tonight, I just stood there, steady, calm. I had already done my part. The last report had gone out 31 days ago, encrypted, time-stamped, and addressed to every federal agency that needed to see it. The moment they fired me, they gave me freedom and proof. They thought they'd silenced me. But all they did was give me time. A voice crackled through the intercom Ryan's. His tone had changed from arrogance to panic. "Claire, if you're in the control room, respond. We need your access credentials." The irony made me almost laugh. I unplugged my headset, powered down the secondary terminal, and took one last look at the flashing red indicators. "You'll need more than my credentials," I murmured. "You'll need integrity." I walked out, closing the heavy glass door behind me. The red light bathed the hallway as if the building itself were bleeding. It wasn't just a breach. It was a reckoning. And by morning, everyone who had ever doubted me would finally understand what a real vulnerability looked like. My name is Claire Whitaker. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 8 years, I've been the quiet ghost inside Harrington Dynamics' security division. If you ever called the help desk and your issue was resolved before lunch, that was probably me. No one ever saw me, but they all depended on me. That was the irony. They built a billion-dollar fortress on data, yet never looked at the woman guarding the gates. I wasn't born into their world. My mother, Evelyn, was once Arthur Harrington's secretary, loyal, diligent, invisible. When Arthur died, his son Michael inherited the empire and married Vivian, a financial strategist with a diamond watch and an iron heart. Vivian brought along her son Ryan, who at 29 became the youngest chief technology officer in Chicago. I became the inconvenient reminder of a history everyone preferred to forget, the daughter of the help. When Michael offered me a job in IT, it was presented as an act of mercy, not merit. "You'll always have a place here, Claire. he had said, smiling with the kind of politeness that feels like a leash. From the first day, I learned what silence meant in this family. In meetings, my reports were glanced at but never read. My voice was tolerated, not heard. Every woman in that building had learned to lower her tone, to speak softly so as not to rattle the egos of the men who believed they built the world. I used to wonder how my mother survived among them. I suppose she did what I did. She adapted, swallowed her anger, and stayed useful. I spent my evenings alone in the lower levels of the building where the servers hummed like sleeping giants. I knew every wire, every port, every vulnerability the company ignored. I built quiet scripts to monitor anomalies, tracking every inconsistency that the upper floors refused to acknowledge. I found patterns that shouldn't exist: irregular data replication, phantom users, unexplained memory spikes. At first, I thought it was just a coding oversight. Then I realized Ryan had built a system designed more for show than safety. He didn't understand restraint. He understood applause. CentraCore, he called it the future of secure financial infrastructure. The name sounded expensive, but the foundation was hollow. It looked perfect in a press release, disastrous in real life. I filed reports, 3 of them each marked high priority. No one answered. A week later, Vivian stopped by my cubicle. She wore a tailored gray suit, her perfume sharp enough to sting. "Claire," she said sweetly, "you're burning hours on things above your clearance. Let's stay in our lane, shall we?" Her smile didn't reach her eyes. That was the moment I understood the truth. They didn't want protection. They wanted control. My position in IT wasn't about contribution, it was containment. My mother warned me once years ago after Arthur's funeral. We sat in the car outside the Harrington mansion, the night rain sliding down the windshield like melted glass. "Claire," she whispered, "these people don't build things. They inherit them. And they protect the illusion, not the legacy." I didn't understand it then, but now it lived in my bones. The further I climbed, the more invisible I became. The more competent I was, the more threatening I seemed. And somewhere deep down, they were still laughing, the silent, polite laughter reserved for those who dared to know too much. I told myself that as long as I did my job well, truth would protect itself. I was wrong. In Harrington Dynamics, truth was a liability. It could cost stock value headlines' reputation. It could cost the wrong people their inheritance. But I kept the logs. I saved every anomaly, every timestamp, every access trace under my own encrypted key, because something in me, something I got from my mother, refused to let silence win. That stubbornness, the quiet insistence that integrity still mattered, was the one thing they could never firewall. The first time I noticed the anomaly, it was 2:13 a.m. on a Thursday. I was the only one left in the office, surrounded by the soft hum of machines and the blue flicker of screensavers. The new CentraCore prototype had begun running its internal stress tests, and something in the data flow felt wrong too. Perfect, too symmetrical. It looked like someone had polished the code for presentation, not for protection. When I dug deeper, I found it a repeating sequence hidden in the authentication logic. A minor oversight if you didn't know what to look for, but if exploited, it would open a silent gateway straight into our clients' core banking systems. The kind of flaw that doesn't just cost money, it costs nations trust. I sat back, staring at the screen, my pulse steady but cold. Ryan had written this code. Or, more accurately, his outsourced Silicon Valley consultants had, and he had taken the credit. I spent the next 48 hours compiling the report logs, comparative analysis recommendations, everything documented. When I finally walked into Michael Harrington's office, the view of the Chicago skyline looked like a stage set. Vivian sat beside him, flipping through papers she wouldn't read. Ryan stood near the window, his reflection overlapping with the city lights. "There's a critical flaw in CentraCore," I began, steady and precise. "Under load, it exposes an unsecured gateway. It could lead to a system-wide breach." Michael didn't look up from his tablet. "Is this another of your theoretical scenarios, Claire?" "No," I said. "This is an imminent risk." Ryan chuckled softly. "You really think you're seeing something our team missed?" "Claire, these are industry veterans. You fix computers. They design them." His condescension was sharp but rehearsed. Vivian's voice came next, syrupy and lethal. Darling, your passion is admirable. But if you start throwing words like breach around, regulators might panic. And panic isn't good for anyone's portfolio. That word portfolio was her religion. I stood there, folder in hand, surrounded by 3 generations of inherited power, and felt that familiar wave of dismissal wash over me. I should have stayed quiet, signed the papers, gone back to my desk. But I didn't. This isn't about panic, I said evenly. It's about prevention. You can fix this before it's too late. Ryan smirked. You mean before I launch it and prove you wrong? Before you launch it, I corrected, and prove me right. The silence that followed was colder than the servers downstairs. Michael finally looked up. Claire, we value your diligence, but your tone borders on insubordination. We're moving forward with the rollout. Vivian closed her folder. Let's not make this emotional. You've done your part. We'll take it from here. Emotional. That was always the word they used to cage women who saw too clearly. I walked out without another word. The next morning, my access permissions were reduced for compliance reasons. Ryan's team went public with the announcement 2 weeks later, a live-streamed event filled with buzzwords and champagne. I watched from the break room, coffee going cold in my hands. Centracor, Ryan declared to the cameras, represents the next frontier in financial security. I caught my reflection in the screen, small and expressionless, and whispered, "It represents the end of yours." No one heard me. Not yet. But I had already made copies of everything: the system architecture, the exploit pattern, the timestamps proving negligence. I wasn't planning revenge. I was documenting truth. Because if they wouldn't listen to warnings whispered in private, they would one day have to answer to evidence written in public. And when that day came, the laughter that haunted every corridor of that company would sound a lot like silence. The following Sunday, I was invited to dinner at the Harrington estate, though invited was too generous a word. Attendance was expected. The house stood on the edge of Lake Michigan, its glass walls reflecting the sunset in sharp angles like a monument to everything money could build and morality couldn't. Inside, the dining table stretched almost the length of the room, set with silver flatware and wine glasses so thin they looked breakable just by looking at them too long. My mother, Evelyn, sat near the end, quiet hands folded, trying to blend into the background as she always did. I took the seat furthest from Vivian, who presided at the head like a queen bored by her subjects. Ryan arrived late in a tailored navy suit smelling like cologne and arrogance. "Sorry," he said lightly. "I was on a call with CNBC. They want a quote before the product launch next week." Vivian's smile was sharp. "Of course they do. Everyone wants to hear from the man who's about to redefine security." My stomach tightened. I stared at my plate, at the reflection of the chandelier in my untouched water glass, and tried to focus on anything but their voices. "You know," Ryan continued, "it's funny. The only real pushback we got was from Claire here. Said something about a vulnerability." He laughed as if recounting a joke. "Imagine that the IT department worrying about encryption she didn't write." A ripple of polite laughter followed. My mother shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to mine silently, begging me not to speak. But silence had never protected her. It had only made her small. "It wasn't about encryption," I said calmly. "It was about logic flow." Ryan waved his fork. "See logic. That's exactly why I hired an entire team of experts. We deal in systems, not speculation." Vivian dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin. "Claire, dear, you're clearly talented, but sometimes you have to trust the people above you. It's how organizations work." I looked at her then, really looked. Her face was flawless, but her eyes were the same ones that used to watch my mother deliver coffee cold, and assessing, always measuring the distance between usefulness and discard. "You mean trust the people who stand to profit the most," I said softly. The table went still. Michael cleared his throat. "That's enough." The moment passed, but something irreversible cracked. They resumed their conversation, but I wasn't listening. I watched my mother's trembling hands, her fork moving food she couldn't taste. She had worked for this family her whole life, given them loyalty, discretion, silence. And for what? To sit at a table where her daughter was mocked for telling the truth. Family dinners should be safe places, she had once told me. But here, safety had always meant submission. Ryan leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine. You'll see, Claire. Once Centricore launches, you'll realize you worried over nothing. Maybe I said. Or maybe you'll realize too late that I wasn't wrong. His smile faltered. For a brief second, I saw something shift behind his eyes. Fear, maybe, or recognition. Then he laughed again, louder than before to cover it. You've always been dramatic, he said. Must run in the family. I looked at my mother, who looked away. The candles flickered. Outside, waves lapped against the shore, steady, indifferent. I felt something cold and precise settle inside me, a line I hadn't realized I was crossing. They thought I was the problem, the emotional one, the outlier. But the truth was simpler. I was the only one in that room still trying to protect them. And when the collapse came, when the empire they worshipped began to fracture, I wouldn't lift a finger to stop it. Because sometimes the only way to teach arrogance is to let it crash under its own weight. The next morning began like every other Monday except for the silence. Offices that usually hummed with artificial confidence felt subdued, as though the building itself sensed what was coming. My badge still worked when I scanned it at the security gate, but when the elevator doors opened on the 47th floor, 2 members of HR were already waiting. Claire said one of them, Lydia, the one with the gentle voice used for bad news, Mr. Harrington would like to see you in his office. I nodded, pretending not to feel the tremor of déjà vu. The walk down that hallway felt longer than it should have, the polished marble floor gleaming like a mirror of mistakes. When I entered, Michael was standing by the window, staring out at the city, his reflection pale against the skyline. Vivian sat in one of the leather chairs, perfectly poised. Ryan was beside her, tapping his pen, bored already. "Have a seat," Michael said. I remained standing. Vivian folded her hands in her lap. "Claire, you've become quite vocal lately about internal security issues. While we appreciate diligence, your recent behavior has disrupted team cohesion." I kept my voice level. "I submitted technical reports through the proper channels." Ryan didn't look up. "And then you sent one to the federal regulators." "That's not diligence, Claire. That's sabotage." I froze. So they'd found out. I'd emailed a sanitized version of my findings to the Federal Cybercrime Bureau a week earlier. No confidential data, just a warning about the risk pattern. A professional courtesy, a moral necessity. That was confidential communication regarding national compliance, I said. "It's my duty as a licensed cybersecurity engineer." "Your duty," Vivian interrupted, her voice. "Cool is to the company that pays you." Michael sighed, weary. "We can't afford internal panic. You've been here long enough to know that perception matters as much as reality." "Reality doesn't care about perception," I replied. Ryan smirked. "There it is, the moral crusader complex." I turned to him. "It's called responsibility. You should try it sometime." His smile tightened. Michael's tone hardened. "Claire, this is not a debate. We've decided to terminate your employment effective immediately." Vivian slid a manila envelope across the desk. "You'll find the severance generous. In exchange, you'll refrain from discussing company operations with external parties." My hands didn't shake when I picked up the envelope. It was heavier than I expected. Money in exchange for silence, an old Harrington tradition. I looked at each of them, committing the scene to memory. Michael's feigned regret, Vivian's clinical detachment, Ryan's smug triumph. "You understand?" Michael said. "This isn't personal." "Of course not," I said softly. "It's professional." Ryan leaned back. "You'll find out soon enough that the world doesn't run on ethics. It runs on influence." I smiled faintly. "Maybe, but influence doesn't stop code from collapsing." His eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" I didn't answer. Lydia appeared in the doorway again, awkward and apologetic. "Security will escort you downstairs, Claire." I turned to leave the envelope still in my hand. As I passed Ryan, he muttered under his breath, "You should have stayed in your lane." I stopped just long enough to say, "You should have stayed humble." The security guards followed me to the elevator, their faces blank. When the doors closed, I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. I wasn't angry. I was clear. They had taken my title, but not my evidence. My access credentials might be revoked by morning, but my encrypted backups already existed off-network, time-stamped, validated, and stored in cloud repositories even Ryan couldn't trace. They thought they had silenced me. They hadn't realized they'd just freed me. When I stepped outside into the cold Chicago air, I tore open the envelope, let the papers scatter in the wind, and whispered to no one in particular, "You'll see soon enough." Integrity leaves a paper trail. I didn't cry that night. I didn't even drink. I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by half-empty coffee mugs and 3 monitors glowing in the dark, the same way I used to sit when debugging late into the night. But this time, I wasn't fixing anything. I was preparing for war, a silent, lawful, documented kind of war. Outside, the Chicago skyline shimmered through the fog, each window a rectangle of light pretending everything inside it was under control. I knew better. I'd seen how the illusion of control collapses the moment you start asking for accountability. I powered up my old workstation, a personal rig I'd built from salvaged parts over the years, deliberately air-gapped from any corporate network. As the system booted, a small folder blinked on the desktop Harrington logs. Inside it were months of flagged irregularities, authentication spikes, ghost sessions, data discrepancies that lined up perfectly with CentraCore's deployment timeline. I didn't need revenge. I needed documentation. There's a difference. Revenge burns out fast. Documentation endures. Around midnight, a secure message popped up on my encrypted channel. Mason. He was one of the few people at Harrington who had ever treated me like an equal. "You okay?" he wrote. "They told everyone you resigned." I smiled bitterly. "That's one word for it." He sent another line. "You were right about the load balancer bug. I ran a private stress test. It's leaking data under concurrent sessions." My hands froze above the keyboard. "Did you save the output?" "Already encrypted. Want me to send it to the bureau contact you mentioned?" "Not yet. Wait for my signal." I logged into my bureau liaison portal using a temporary credential I'd been issued months earlier for a federal compliance audit. I uploaded a redacted version of my report, enough to raise flags, not enough to trigger panic. If the bureau moved too soon, Harrington's PR machine would bury it under false alarm headlines. Timing mattered. The truth needed to arrive exactly when denial became impossible. I leaned back and glanced at the photo on my desk, my mother years ago standing beside Arthur Harrington at a company gala. Her smile was small, polite, a woman proud to belong to something that never truly accepted her. She had believed loyalty could protect her. I believed proof could protect me. Different eras, same delusion. Around 3 a.m., I got another message from Mason Ryan's locking down access logs. "You were right, he's covering tracks." I typed quickly. "Mirror everything and ghost it to the cold server. No tracebacks. Got it. If this blows up, I'm fired. If it doesn't blow up, we all are." He sent a thumbs-up emoji because humor was the only shield left for honest people in corrupt systems. By dawn, I'd compiled 3 packages, one for the Federal Cybercrime Bureau, one for the Office of Financial Integrity, and one sealed envelope labeled, "If I disappear." It wasn't paranoia. It was protocol. I shut everything down, burned the temporary keys, and backed up the evidence to an external drive I placed in a safety deposit box across town. Then I made coffee, black, no sugar. As the sun rose over the frozen lake, I realized something had changed. For the first time in years, I wasn't scared. Harrington Dynamics had always treated me like a liability, an inconvenience with a conscience. But conscience, when weaponized by truth, is more dangerous than any virus. They thought they'd fired a problem. In reality, they'd released one. By the time the first headlines hit, by the time the first regulator asked the right question, the empire they worshipped would already be bleeding from the inside. I closed my laptop and whispered into the quiet, "Let the system crash itself." 2 weeks later, the Harringtons stood on a stage framed by cameras and light. The company had transformed its newest product launch into a spectacle, a parade of arrogance disguised as innovation. CNBC streamed it live banners reading CentraCore, the future of financial security, flashing behind the speakers. I watched from my small apartment, coffee in hand, the city glowing beyond the windows. Ryan stood front and center, hair slicked back, voice dripping with practiced confidence. "Today," he declared, "we redefine trust in digital infrastructure." The crowd of investors and employees erupted in applause. Vivian smiled beside him, every inch the queen she imagined herself to be, her diamond necklace catching the light. Michael offered handshakes and polite laughter, proud of the empire he believed he controlled. I muted the sound and watched their faces move like a silent film. The more they spoke, the clearer it became they weren't launching technology. They were launching denial. The system had been designed to impress investors, not defend institutions. Its encryption layers were showpieces, its redundancies cosmetic. And behind it all was a single flaw buried under PR polish, a ticking time bomb masquerading as brilliance. Mason messaged me mid-broadcast, load tests failed again. He called it a minor calibration delay. I typed back, he's stalling. The system can't handle concurrent encryption streams. It'll implode the second it scales. And when it does, he asked, it'll take them all down with it. I could have stopped it then. I had the technical knowledge to patch the flaw temporarily to prevent the collapse that was now mathematically inevitable. But I didn't. You can't save people from the consequences they choose to ignore. You can only document the truth and let the truth do its work. The next morning, the media called the launch a triumph of engineering. Ryan was photographed shaking hands with government officials, while Vivian gave an interview about the integrity of the Harrington legacy. I almost laughed at the word. Integrity was the one currency they never learned to manage. That weekend, I met Mason at a diner near the Federal Building. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. They're pushing full integration next month, he said quietly. No audits, no delay. Then the timeline moves faster, I replied. We keep feeding verified data to the Bureau. Once the first anomaly hits, they'll have enough to intervene. You really think they'll listen? He asked. They didn't listen to you. I stirred my coffee. They'll listen when the numbers crash. He hesitated. You don't want credit, do you? Credit? I smiled faintly. I want accountability. The waitress brought the check, and Mason slid a small flash drive across the table wrapped in a napkin. Everything from last week's logs. They'll deny it's real, so make sure you've got backups. I always do. When I got home, I watched the replay of the launch one last time. Ryan on stage, smiling, selling lying. The camera caught him saying, "We've achieved the impossible." He wasn't wrong. They'd achieved the impossible. They'd built a fortress so obsessed with its reflection that no one noticed the cracks forming in its foundation, and I was done trying to warn them. Every lie eventually meets the truth. Every empire eventually meets its own data trail. When I shut off the screen, I caught my reflection in the dark glass, calm, deliberate, unflinching. For the first time in years, I didn't see the company's IT girl. I saw a woman holding a mirror up to power and refusing to look away. They thought the launch was the beginning of their legacy. It was the beginning of their audit. The first alert came at 2:47 a.m., a cascading failure notice pinging through every monitoring system across Harrington Dynamics network. By sunrise, Centricor had gone from the future of financial security to the greatest cybersecurity collapse in modern banking. 20 national institutions reported compromised authentication chains, customer data leaking into foreign proxy servers, and cross-account transfers triggered by ghost transactions. It was surgical. It was catastrophic. It was exactly what I'd warned them about. Mason called me first. His voice was breathless. Claire, it's happening. Every client node is collapsing. They're trying to isolate the breach, but it's replicating itself. I opened my laptop. My custom monitoring dashboard flickered alive, displaying what the public couldn't yet see: entire server clusters blinking offline, encryption handshakes failing in loops. They'll try to blame the banks, I said quietly. But the infection started from their architecture. Vivian's in the office, Mason said. Ryan, too. They've locked the floor down. I could almost picture it, the panic behind glass walls, the scramble to contain a monster they'd refused to acknowledge. Stay out of it, I told him. Back up what you can and disappear. They'll look for scapegoats. He hesitated. They're already talking about you, Claire. I almost laughed. Of course they are. 30 minutes later, my phone lit up again, an unlisted number. I answered, and Vivian's voice cracked through the line, brittle but commanding. Claire, I need your access credentials. The system won't authorize my override. Her tone had lost its polish. For the first time, it wasn't Vivian, the CFO, speaking. It was a woman cornered by her own arrogance. You fired me, I said evenly. You made sure I didn't have access to anything. We don't have time for this. The board's on emergency call. The banks are threatening to pull out. I let the silence hang long enough for her to feel it. You said I was just the IT girl, I said softly. Remember, Claire, this isn't personal. No, I interrupted. It's professional. And professionally, I warned you this would happen. Please, she said, and for a brief second her voice cracked. We're losing everything. I closed my eyes, remembering every dinner, every smirk, every dismissal. Then you're finally learning what loss feels like. I ended the call. 10 minutes later, the first headlines hit the news. Harrington Dynamics faces historic system breach. By noon, it was everywhere: CNN, Bloomberg, The Wall Street Journal. The stock plummeted. The board issued a statement blaming unidentified external actors. But the Bureau already knew. They'd been monitoring since the first flag I filed. My encrypted evidence had been opened that morning. I received an email from my Bureau contact subject line confirmed. I stared at it for a long time before replying. Proceed with full audit authorization. Outside, the wind howled off the lake, sharp and cold. The city was waking up to headlines about digital chaos, but I felt strangely calm. It wasn't satisfaction, it was symmetry. The collapse had been written the day they chose image over integrity. Mason messaged again. Ryan's losing it. He's blaming everyone. Vivian's screaming at legal. Michael's not even in the building. And you, I asked, backing everything to the Bureau. You were right, Claire. Every line you flagged, it's the same exploit. It was never patched. It was never meant to be. I wrote. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed one last time. This time, it wasn't a voice I expected. It was Ryan. He didn't bother with pleasantries. You did this. I looked out the window, watching the snow fall against the lake. No, I said. You did this when you ignored the truth. You think you're better than us? No, I replied. Just more careful. He said something else, anger may be a threat, but I didn't listen. I hung up and powered off my phone. The world was already listening to the truth now, and there was nothing any of them could do to rewrite it. The breach had exposed everything they tried to hide. Their systems, their lies, their legacy. And the woman they laughed at became the only one left who didn't need saving. The following week, the Bureau's invitation arrived as a formality. A black SUV waited outside my apartment before dawn, its headlights slicing through the Chicago fog. Inside, 2 agents greeted me politely, but cautiously. Whistleblowers made them nervous. I didn't blame them. The conference room in the Federal Cybercrime Bureau's downtown office was nothing like the sleek halls of Harrington Dynamics. No glass walls, no city views, just gray carpet and quiet focus. A projector glowed against the far wall, displaying a frozen frame of the breach map I had built months ago. The director, a compact woman in her 50s, named Special Agent Marla DeVries, motioned to the chair at the front. Ms. Whitaker, we've been reviewing your reports. You predicted this down to the hour. I didn't predict it, I said evenly. I measured it. The data spoke. They ignored it. DeVries folded her hands. Can you walk us through what we're looking at? I stood, clicked to the next slide, and the diagram burst into life. A cascading chain of data nodes collapsing in real time. This, I said, pointing, isn't a hack. It's a failure loop built into their architecture. Under peak load, the encryption keys sync faster than the validation gate can handle. It opens a phantom channel. Anyone who knows where to look can slip through. One of the analysts leaned forward. You're saying this was negligence, not external interference. Negligence dressed as innovation, I replied. They built a system for headlines, not for humans. The room went quiet. Behind the glass partition, I could see more agents gathering, whispering to each other, recognizing the scope of what this meant. Billions of dollars, international clients, financial chaos. Why didn't they fix it when you warned them, DeVries asked? I paused, because fixing it meant admitting they were wrong. Her mouth tightened. We've subpoenaed internal correspondence. You'll be asked to testify. I'll testify, I said, but my evidence speaks louder than I can. That afternoon, they took my official statement under oath. Every detail matched the logs. Every timestamp matched the internal emails Mason had mirrored. It was airtight. There was no room for spin. As I left the building, my phone buzzed. Mason, they're losing their minds. Ryan's in hiding, Vivian's lawyering up. Michael's statement says you manipulated the code yourself. I sighed. Of course he does. When truth fails, they rewrite the story. Claire! He replied, "You should know the Bureau's freezing their accounts. You started a domino effect." I looked up at the gray Chicago sky. "No," I said quietly to myself, "they started it when they built the house on lies." 2 days later, the congressional inquiry began. Reporters filled the steps of the Capitol building as executives in tailored suits tried to look composed. The world finally saw what I'd been seeing for years, the rot beneath the glass. They questioned Ryan first. Cameras captured his confidence melting into panic as evidence after evidence was displayed. My report, my models, my correspondence, all of it entered into public record. He denied it, then contradicted himself, then fell silent. When my turn came, the chamber felt colder than I expected. The chairman asked Ms. Whitaker, "In your professional opinion, how could this have been prevented?" I met his gaze. By listening. By remembering that security isn't about power. It's about humility. There was no applause, no cinematic closure, just the faint scratch of pens as they wrote it down. But in that moment, I knew the truth had finally found a home it couldn't be evicted from. Afterward, DeVries caught me in the hallway. "You did good work," she said. "Not just for us, for everyone." I nodded. It shouldn't have taken a collapse for them to believe. She hesitated. "Sometimes collapse is the only teacher left." Outside, flashbulbs exploded as I stepped into the cold. The reporters shouted my name, but I didn't stop. I wasn't there for headlines. I'd already written my legacy in code and consequence. The inquiry wasn't my punishment or my vindication. It was their mirror. And now, for once, they were forced to look. By the time the congressional hearings concluded, the empire had already started to rot in public. Harrington Dynamics' stock fell 63% in a single day, wiping out nearly 2 decades of accumulated power. Their smiling advertisements were replaced by emergency statements, their once polished reputation dissolving under the weight of evidence. You could almost feel the panic rippling through the financial world. Every news network ran the same headline, "The breach that should never have happened." That afternoon, I sat in a cafe across from the old Harrington Tower, a building that now looked less like a monument and more like a tomb. Outside, reporters swarmed, security guards tried to control the chaos, and investors demanded refunds that would never come. My coffee went cold as I watched the reflection of the tower shudder in the puddle outside the window. For years, that building had been a symbol of power. Now it was just glass and guilt. The TV above the counter showed a live press conference. Michael Harrington stood at the podium, his voice shaking under the weight of accountability. His once carefully combed hair was disheveled, his tie loosened. "We acknowledge the failures that led to this event," he said stiffly, "and we are cooperating fully with federal investigators." A reporter shouted, "Is it true your former employee Claire Whitaker warned you?" Michael's eyes flickered. "We are not here to discuss internal matters," he said, but his voice cracked at the edges. The camera zoomed in, catching that flicker the moment a man realized his empire was built on denial. Beside him, Vivian stood pale and motionless. She wasn't wearing her usual diamond necklace. Her hands were clasped together, knuckles white. Behind her, Ryan stared down jaw tight, the face of a man who had finally met the consequences of his own ego. The footage cut to analysts discussing systemic ethical collapse. One anchor said, "This isn't just a cybersecurity failure, it's a moral one." The words lingered in the air. A moral one. That was exactly what it was. Later that night, Mason called again. His voice was soft, almost reverent. "It's over, Claire. The Bureau froze all their executive accounts. The SEC launched investigations. Ryan's been suspended indefinitely." I closed my eyes. "And Vivian? She's negotiating a plea for obstruction. And Michael resigned, effective immediately." The board forced him out. They might lose everything. I looked at the window again. A snowstorm had started, thick flakes falling against the dark glass. "No," I said quietly. "They already did." He didn't answer right away. Then softly, "You could go on record. Tell your side." "I already did. The evidence is my voice." He chuckled weakly. "You're colder than the lake in February." "Not cold," I said. "Just finished." For a long time, I watched the snow drift down onto the street, muffling the city. Justice doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives in silence in the empty hallways of towers that thought they were untouchable. Harrington Dynamics had become a ghost. A week later, the Bureau released its final report. My name appeared in the credits as lead source technical consultant. No fanfare, no interviews, just a small acknowledgement in black and white proof that integrity had outlasted influence. A message came to my inbox that night from an unfamiliar address. It was from Michael. "You were right," it said. "I should have listened. For what it's worth, I'm sorry." I stared at the words for a long time, then deleted the email without replying. Sorry was currency long past its expiration date. The next morning, the Harrington Tower went dark. Literally. The logo lights were shut off, the revolving door locked, the lobby emptied. Chicago commuters passed by without a second glance. Empires fall quietly after all. I stood across the street one last time, hands in my pockets, and whispered to no one in particular, "I warned you." Then I turned away because the story was no longer mine to carry. It belonged to history, now the kind written not by victors but by witnesses. 1 year later, I walked through the marble corridors of the Federal Cyber Integrity Task Force, the place I now called work. My badge didn't say technician anymore. It read, Senior Security Architect, Whitaker Protocol Division. The title wasn't just a promotion, it was a declaration. We were building the system. Harrington Dynamics never had the courage to imagine transparency, accountability, and resilience designed from the ground up. The kind of framework that valued truth more than optics. Every morning I passed the glass wall of the main conference room where a plaque hung in quiet defiance. It read, "Integrity is the only firewall that never fails." I hadn't written that quote, but they attributed it to me anyway. It made me smile sometimes because it sounded grander than what I'd actually said. The truth was simpler: if you don't build systems with honesty, they'll betray you faster than any hacker ever could. Mason was part of my team now. He handled infrastructure audits, same meticulous precision, same dry humor. "You realize," he said one morning over coffee, "we've become the thing we used to warn people about government bureaucrats." Maybe, I said, but at least we're the kind that listens. Our project, the Whitaker Protocol, had become the new compliance benchmark for every major financial institution in the country. It mandated independent audits, multi-layer verification, and public transparency for all critical security infrastructures. In short, it made it impossible for another Harrington-type empire to hide negligence behind PR polish. I'd turned the blueprint of their downfall into the foundation of reform. One afternoon, while reviewing system logs, Mason slid a printed email onto my desk. "This came for you," he said. It was from Ryan. I hadn't heard from him since the hearings. The subject line read simply, "For what it's worth." I opened it. "Claire, I used to think you enjoyed making me look small. Now I understand you were trying to make the system stronger. I won't ask for forgiveness, I don't deserve it. But you should know every lecture I give now starts with your name. Because I want people to remember that arrogance is the most expensive vulnerability there is. Ryan." I stared at the page for a long time before setting it aside. Regret had finally found its way to him. It came late, but it came. That was enough. The next week, the New York Times ran an article titled, "From Whistleblower to Architect, the Woman Who Rebuilt Trust in Tech." I didn't read it. Mason did, though, and left it folded on my desk with a note scribbled across the margin. "You made the system believe in integrity again." But that wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the silence, peaceful, earned silence. No sirens, no crises, no alarms. Just the steady hum of code doing exactly what it was meant to do, protect. On the anniversary of the breach, the Bureau hosted a small commemoration. DeVries was there as stoic as ever, handing me a framed certificate. "For service beyond compliance," it said. She shook my hand and whispered, "You reminded us why ethics has to live inside the code, not outside it." That night, as I left the building, snow fell again, soft and clean, covering the city in white. I paused on the steps, breathing in the sharp air, and thought about my mother. About the life she'd spent serving a family that had never seen her worth. She used to tell me, truth has no inheritance. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe integrity could be passed down not by blood, but by choice. I looked up at the skyline, the empty Harrington Tower still standing but dark. A ghost of what once was. Then I whispered into the wind the system learned. Because that's what justice really is. Not revenge, not triumph. Just learning finally what truth costs and why it's worth every consequence. The snow had already begun to melt when I finally drove out to Lake Forest where my mother was buried. It had taken me a year to come back. The road wound past the same estates that once defined the Harrington legacy. Vast lawns, shuttered mansions, marble gates that seemed to hide more ghosts than memories. Somewhere behind those walls, people were still trying to rewrite history to soften the story of their collapse. But the truth had already been archived, time-stamped, authenticated, and public. You can't redact a reckoning. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of silence that felt earned. My mother's headstone sat near a line of birch trees overlooking the frozen lake. I brushed the snow from her name, Evelyn Whitaker, and smiled faintly. "You used to say truth costs too much," I whispered. But I learned something. Silence costs more. The wind lifted through the trees, sharp and soft, as if she were answering. I thought about how she used to walk those office halls carrying coffee for people who would never remember her name, believing that loyalty could earn her safety. I'd spent years trying to be the opposite of her, rational, where she was gentle, defiant, where she was obedient. But in the end, we were both trying to survive in the same world built by men who mistook inheritance for intelligence. The difference was I'd lived long enough to change the system that swallowed her. Before leaving, I placed a small flash drive at the base of her headstone. Not with code or evidence those battles were done, but with letters, photos, and scanned memories of every woman who had written to me since the breach. Thousands of them. Programmers, analysts, engineers, clerks. Some had been silenced, others ignored all of them fighting to be heard. Their words filled the drive completely. That was her legacy now, truth carried forward by voices no longer afraid to speak. As I stood, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A news alert. Harrington Dynamics officially declares bankruptcy. The final chapter. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then laughed softly. It took you long enough. On impulse, I drove to the city. The tower still stood there, its glass reflecting the dull winter light, but the sign had been stripped from the entrance. Where it once read Harrington Dynamics, there was only an empty metal frame rusting quietly in the wind. I parked across the street and walked closer. Through the glass doors, I could see the lobby vacant, echoing. The grand chandelier was gone. The marble floors were covered in dust. For the first time, the building looked honest. An older security guard nodded at me as I approached. "Place has been empty a while," he said. "You work here once?" I hesitated. "Something like that." He smiled kindly. "Shame what happened, but maybe it's for the best. World needs new builders." I nodded. "Yes, it does." Back outside, the lake wind bit at my face. I slipped on my gloves and looked up at the dark windows one last time. I remembered the laughter echoing through those halls, the mockery, the dismissals, the way they used to look at me as if I were a glitch in their perfect system. And I remembered how easily they'd fallen. "They laughed at the IT girl," I murmured, "but she rewrote their code." The clouds parted briefly, sunlight cutting across the tower's broken letters. It looked like closure. Not vengeance, not triumph, just truth settling where it belonged. When I got home, the flash of the city lights faded behind me. I poured a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and opened a new document on my laptop. Title Integrity by Design. Lessons from a Collapse. It wasn't for publication. It was for the next generation, the interns, the women who still sat in rooms where their warnings went unheard. I wanted them to have a manual not on revenge, but on resilience. Before shutting down for the night, I typed one last line. Sometimes the firewall isn't a system. It's a person who refuses to stay silent. Then I pressed save, and for the first time in years, I felt the world go quiet in the best possible way. Because justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't make noise. It endures.